So when my daughter Mallory died in 2017, I fell off a cliff. I needed a prescription for living, a way to emerge stronger. Scattering rose petals in Mallory's memory 6 months after her passion was when I decided to turn my pain into purpose. It's my great pleasure to share her story with you, and while Mallory's disease might be different than yours, her insights will likely resonate. I'll start back in 1995 when Mallory was 3 and she was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. The CF specialist told us about the medicines and machines she would need and the limitations she would face. He seemed hopeful when he said that the lifespan for children with CF had increased from 5 to 25 and that they expected it to get even longer. But all Mark and I heard was that our child had an expiration date. I was bawling my eyes out, so I asked the doctor how he dealt with hysterical parents and very sick children. His perspective helped me. He said he treated kids who had been beaten, burned, or abandoned. He saw the love we had for Mallory and the smile on her face, and he promised us that she would have a happy life. Mallory had lots of symptoms, a persistent cough, a chronic runny nose, and serious GI problems. Mallory would come to say, the doctors are only focused on my lungs because that's what will kill me, but the GI problems are what ruined my life. I was desperate for a way to explain the disease to Mallory and to her brother Micah, but there was no children's book about CF back then. So I wrote one, Mallory's 65 Roses. 65 Roses is what kids hear when adults say cystic fibrosis. That first year, Mallory hated doing treatment. Every day when it was time to start, she would hide in the closet, under the bed, anywhere she thought that we wouldn't find her. So Mark made up a game he called Astronaut and Pat Pat. Astronaut was for the mask that delivered her inhaled medications, and Pat Pat was for the chest percussion therapy. We read the book to Mallory's class every September. We gave a copy to each of her friends and even the boys when she started dating, because it provided an easy way to explain her illness, which for so long was invisible. This book taught Mallory the power of narrative. My daughter had a happy childhood, and once she got used to doing treatment, she was always compliant until one day when she was 9. She refused to do them anymore. So for the first time, we introduced the idea that CF could be fatal and explained it's why she had to do treatment. Mallory listened carefully and then ran out of the room crying. She did not speak to us for 3 days, but after that, she never missed a treatment. And she started writing, first in a notebook, then at the age of 15 on a computer. She lived every day knowing she had a chronic illness that would someday kill her. It's why she kept this journal. Through the years, Mallory's medical teams became a huge part of our lives, and they would often ask if med students and residents could come to her room for bedside training. Mallory always said yes, and she was always engaged. Doctors and nurses called her the poster child for compliance, and they all loved her. They didn't always love me, because I was the bad cop to Mallory's good cop. I felt it was my job to protect her, even when it made me unpopular. There were so many things that got me into trouble. I was known to block the door to Mallory's hospital room before 6 a.m. when they wanted to empty her trash, write her daily goals on the board, or drop off medications when she had been up until well after midnight doing a treatment because a nurse had a coding patient, the pharmacy was backed up, or there was a late night admit. Sleep does not seem to be valued in the hospital, so I fought for it. I would sneak Mallory out to get her hair washed or to go for a walk outside, even though protocol dictates you can't leave the hospital. But it was important to keep her mentally as well as physically healthy. I'd sneak her beloved dog Kona in at night. Pet therapy is great medicine. I pushed for faster response times when delays put Mallory's care at risk. Another issue that caused problems was the inconsistency between days and nights. During the day shift, there are layers of staff and management is always watching. But at night, it feels like a ghost town. With no system of checks and balances, more mistakes seem to happen. That was Mark's experience. He used to sleep bedside when I needed a break and would complain all too often. when things would come up at night that there was no one to address them. Mallory writes, "It isn't the big, groundbreaking health events or even the scariest set of test results that make life with chronic illness difficult. It's the petty frustrations and humiliations that overtax my patience and goodwill and leave me drained and weakened." Mallory was always reluctant to make waves, so I would be the one to intervene. And these examples lead to the first insight I'll share today, which is that parents play an important role in treating a child with chronic illness. Now, this might seem really obvious, but I learned from reading Mallory's journal that when Mark and I fought with the team, it was traumatic for her, which makes sense because when the two most important support systems a patient relies on are at odds, it creates stress for the patient. When Mallory was 12, she was colonized by Cepacia, a normally harmless bacteria that wreaks havoc in CF patients. It's the ultimate superbug. Doctors warned us that things would get way more difficult. So to set the tone for Mallory's life, I adopted a mantra: no pity party. My goal was to help Mallory find joy in every day. Mallory went on to adopt her own mantra, which was live happy. Family was always important to Mallory. She and her brother Micah were very close. In high school, she had lots of friends. She was a straight A student and a 3-sport varsity athlete. Second half of senior year in high school, Mallory got very sick and she was admitted through pediatrics with large photos of furry animals adorning the walls. But about 10 days in, they said that they needed the bed for a young pediatric patient, and they moved Mallory to the adult floor. Gone was the cheerful decor, replaced by stark white walls and no playful pictures. It really was an abrupt change and also a foreshadowing of what adult care would be like. That admission was long, marked by raging fevers and a bad bout with sepsis. Nurses working the front lines during the current pandemic report how difficult things have been, in part because of the panic that they see in the eyes of their COVID patients. Their descriptions mirror Mallory's feelings about this long and scary hospitalization. During that admission, a social worker introduced Mallory to the idea of a worry box, a place to put your grief and fear. The theory is that writing down your worries and putting them in a box allows you to let go. You open the box when you want to sit with those feelings, and you close it when you want to move forward. For Mallory, sitting with her feelings propelled her to write, "I'm in the intermediate ICU wing of the medical center. As the days wear on, I find myself panicking as I grow more oxygen dependent, experiencing pain with breathing, no longer able to walk without help. Outside of the hospital, life goes on. My swim team friends are at the peak of training intensity, graduation speaker auditions are being held, and prom is coming. I could not make Mallory better, but I was determined to keep her happy, and one way to do that was to help her get to her prom. She was worried she wouldn't be able to find a date, so I asked her coach, Rob Bowie, pictured here, to see if he could help. He said, "I'm on it." And when I told Mallory that Dylan, the boy she had a crush on, was going to come to the hospital to visit, she could not imagine how that was happening. Of this funny, awkward encounter, Mallory writes, "This afternoon, I'm sitting in my hospital room and Dylan walks in with flowers. I have no idea how my mom and the nurses worked this out, and I'm not really sure I want to know." But the unusual promposal motivated Mallory to work hard to get her strength back. She was desperate to be out of the hospital in time for prom. Her hard work paid off, and Mallory was so happy. To her surprise, she was voted prom queen. After languishing in a hospital bed for so many weeks on end, Mallory was grateful to be out with friends. And it was an incredible evening until the after party. Someone threw a smoke bomb into the venue. Mallory's throat started to burn. Her lungs were searing. Her eyes and her nose were watering. And then hemoptysis, when the airways bleed. Mallory writes of this experience, "Each time I cough up blood, I wonder if this will be the time when the blood spilling up my lungs and out my mouth will burst forth so fast that I can't breathe. The time my hemoptysis isn't just a scare, but the final, swift, deadly bullet." Terrifying hospitalizations like this had distilled for Mallory a profound understanding of how precarious her life was, how lucky she was to be alive. In her journal, she quotes Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. "I have to remember everything, collect the wisps, the threads of untidy happenings." She decided to audition for graduation speaker, and with 600 students in her public school class, competition was stiff. But Mallory was chosen, and in her speech, she quotes the universally respected English philosopher, Winnie the Pooh. "I used to believe in forever, but forever was too good to be true." Mallory chose these words carefully to be relevant to her classmates, but the second, private meaning was inspired by what she refers to as the dark voices in my head, the brokers of hopelessness. Those voices stayed with Mallory in the summer after high school. She was living at the beach because the magical combo of sun and salt helps thin the mucus. Despite her love of the ocean, of sand and sea, Mallory was deeply stressed because for the first time, she had to think about when and how to tell her new college community about her invisible illness. Mallory's perennial smile belied her anguish. She writes, "I'm living a double life right now, the life of someone with a serious illness and serious complications, but also the life of a student, a friend, an athlete." When Mallory arrived at Stanford in the fall of 2010, she was very stressed. But fortunately, dorm living has a way of establishing immediate intimacy, and word spread quickly, relieving Mallory of the burden of disclosure. But still, it was a very difficult transition because after growing up with a helicopter mom, Mallory desperately wanted to be independent. But at the same time, she knew that having my help made things easier. She had to learn how to juggle academic, social, and medical responsibilities to fit everything in. But over time, she adjusted, studied hard, went to football games, and played club volleyball, despite many dozens of hospitalizations. In total, there would be 67, with admissions ranging from weeks to months. In her junior year, Mallory worked as a peer health educator in a freshman dorm. She was responsible for the social and emotional health of the residents. She used to joke that the job in description should include sexual health, because as the dorm-sanctioned provider of condoms, that's really all the students wanted to talk about or get from her. But in fact, this job was important for so many reasons. During a writing exercise with her residents, Mallory saw a pattern that the freshmen were stressed and didn't feel they deserved to be there. Mallory was able to reassure them she had felt the same way, and she writes about the duck syndrome. When students are like ducks gliding on the water, what no one sees is that underneath they are paddling furiously. Mallory would write, "The stress of working to make things seem effortless creates a vicious cycle of silence and struggle." This applies to physical and mental health issues that so many of us experience. Mallory had both. To manage her anxiety, Mallory spent time in nature whenever possible. She cared deeply about the environment. She writes, "For years, I've had the unshakable sense that being in nature, specifically the ocean, somehow heals me, clears my lungs, prolongs my life, maintains my sanity, restores my soul. My intuition was right. While I was swimming, surfing, and fighting CF, researchers in Australia were discovering what I already knew. CF patients who frequent the ocean live longer, 10 years longer." Mallory was fascinated with the intersection of human and environmental health, and in her senior thesis, she compares the degradation of her lungs by the colonization of a superbug to the degradation of native Hawaii by the colonization of foreigners. Mallory recorded the piece as a podcast. It was called Biome, and she played it on NPR. The analogy Mallory draws helped her process what was happening to her body. It was terrifying. And of her fears, Mallory writes, "My memory, nearly photographic at times, serves me well in school, but it curses me at night. My internal hallucinations are so haunting, I can't escape them, even when I close my eyes. because the images play on my eyelids as if projected on a movie screen. It's scary to think I might look back and realize I could have done amazing things, but I didn't because fear held me back. Fear protects us from dangerous things, but unwarranted fear prevents us from reaching our full potential. It has been crushing to learn that Mallory suffered so much. Her emotional pain was never addressed until I pushed for a psych consult. Doctors were so focused on her survival that they just missed the signs of mental distress. Despite her demons, Mallory did reach her potential and graduated from Stanford Phi Beta Kappa, so excited to do field research. But sadly, the doctors said no to every single project she asked about because exposure to environmental toxins would further damage her lungs. She was devastated. But no one, not even close friends really, understood her distress because Mallory still looked so healthy that everyone thought she was the golden girl who had it all. She would have traded everything for the chance to take a breath that didn't hurt, to have a life that wasn't defined by illness. As her body deteriorated, Mallory sharpened her mind, crystallized her thinking, and honed her writing skills. She would write, "I am limited in what I can do, but not in what I can say." Cystic fibrosis does a lot of taking, of dreams, of time, of travel, of friendships, of freedom, of potential, of plans, of lives. But you can't be negative because negative feelings hurt creativity, the very same creativity that will help you as you reinvent your possibilities and go after your goals. Mallory fought hard to reinvent her own possibilities without giving up on her dream of working in environmental education. So instead of doing field work, she got hired to write a book, The Gottlieb Native Garden, a California love story about the importance of using native plants and gardening for wildlife. Conservation, even to those committed to stewardship, can seem unobtainable. The publication of this book enabled Mallory to realize that she could still make a difference despite her limitations. The book received a lot of acclaim, but when Mallory should have been on book tour, her infection reignited, landing her back in the hospital for a very long stretch of time. During this period, her friends were grappling with normal post-college questions, but Mallory was dealing with IVs, ICUs, and indignities, like having doctors, nurses, and residents ask about her bowel habits in front of her friends, even when she repeatedly asked them not to. It was humiliating. She was also in excruciating pain 3 different times, 3 different hospitals. Once it was for pleurisy, once a pulmonary embolism, and then again after transplant. The opioid epidemic has left the medical community working to regain control over prescribing patterns. As a result, well-meaning doctors would routinely underprescribe meds to Mallory out of their fears of creating another addict, even though each time she was an inpatient and they were monitoring her dose. Mallory writes, "I feel like I'm drowning from lack of oxygen, but when I ask for pain meds, they treat me like I'm a drug seeker." Despite Mallory's distress at inadequate pain management, at another point, she writes about her own fears of getting addicted. "I never thought I would say this, but I have come to love the feeling of being on opioids. They were never part of my treatment, but as my chest pain became unbearable, I needed them to breathe. They also helped with my mood. With morphine and oxy, there is no pain. There is no sadness." These anecdotes lead to insight number 2, which is that fear of addiction must be better balanced with need when it comes to pain management. After college, the issue of when to disclose her invisible illness resurfaced. She worried about burdening new friends and about scaring potential employers. At one point, Mallory interviewed for a writing job with a company who said she was absolutely perfect and loved her submissions, which were writing samples that she had worked on during a hospital admission. The company offered her a great job with a high salary. She thought it was important to disclose that she had CF, And when she did, they decided it wasn't a good fit and withdrew their offer. Mallory was deeply disappointed. She also feared that no man would ever love her enough to accept the complications of her disease, so she often held back. But there was something about Jack, her real-life Prince Charming, that left her wrestling with the decision. They had first met on New Year's Eve. Mallory had just gotten out of the hospital and she was still on around-the-clock IV antibiotics. She thought Jack was super cute and very nice, but since she was living in LA and he was living in Palo Alto, she didn't give him a second thought. But months later, when she moved back up north, they re-met at a party and were playing a game of spike ball when she felt a bout of hemoptysis coming on. So she ran into the bathroom to cough up blood. When she came out, she had blood on her shirt and she was very pale. So Jack expressed concern. And this leads to insight number 3. It's difficult to know when to disclose an invisible illness. Mallory came to the conclusion that there is no right or wrong in terms of timing. But with Jack, she decided to disclose right away for 2 reasons. First, she wanted to know, is this person who's there for me when I'm lighthearted and laughing also going to be there for me when I'm sick and sedated? Second, she wanted him to know what he was getting into. And it's a good thing she told him, because a few days later, Mallory ended up back in the hospital, and it was the first of many more back-to-back admissions to come. At this point, the antibiotics had stopped working, and the only option left was transplant. The 2 centers where she had been a patient for most of her life turned her down. In fact, they wouldn't even evaluate her. Mallory, again, was crushed. They also said they didn't think any other center would take her complicated case. So she felt completely abandoned by her CF teams. My regret is that I didn't push harder for them to have a conversation with her. Didn't they owe her that? I begged them to keep trying to find a hospital that would evaluate her. And instead, we decided to stop treatment and take a trip to Hawaii, because if Mallory was going to die, I wanted her to be near the ocean, her happy place. For 6 magical days, Mallory was oxygen and IV free. She got to surf, swim, and paddleboard. But on day 7, the fever started and shot up to 103.5. Mallory was admitted to the Maui hospital, but they didn't know anything about Cepacia or have the medications that she needed. So we asked her brother Micah to fly to Oahu. He did and returned with 60 pounds of IV balls. We were going to stay put until Mallory was stable to fly. Then the national news announced the worst hurricane in decades was headed straight for Maui. So we scrambled to get one of the last planes out before they closed the airport. And it was in the midst of this utter chaos that we got a call from UPMC that Mallory was approved for evaluation. She was all smiles despite her high fever. I was ecstatic, but the coordinator said to not get excited, that she'd seen too many people get approved for evaluation, but then be denied coverage. I promised her that that wouldn't happen. I told her that my husband's a lawyer and he has fought every denial, and that I'm a publicist and I would be on the Today Show exposing their refusal to pay. But Mallory was denied. Getting insurance approval for an out-of-state, out-of-network hospital was the most excruciating non-medical challenge we faced. The battle raged for weeks. They employed multiple stall tactics that Mallory felt were intended to run the clock out on her life. It was going to take a miracle to turn no into yes. We got the miracle. It came in the form of a close friend who knew someone at the highest level of our insurance company's management. Mallory did not want to accept the evaluation because she felt guilty that others had not been able to overturn their denials and some had died waiting. I urged Mallory to use her privilege, her access, and the power of the pen to expose this injustice. She documents the entire battle and writes that insurance companies are inflicting needless additional suffering on patients who are already in distress. And she called it outrageous and incomprehensible. And it leads to her 4th insight, which is that doctors, not insurance companies, should decide what kind of care their patient needs and where they should get it. In early October of 2016, Mallory and I flew to Pittsburgh for a grueling week, meeting the various teams that had to weigh in on her case. We were on pins and needles, waiting to hear from the transplant team. They had promised to call on Monday or Tuesday, but they didn't, and so we were highly anxious. They did finally call on Wednesday, which was Mallory's 24th birthday, to say they were accepting her as a candidate for transplant, but that at 40% lung function, she was still too healthy to come. We were overjoyed, thinking that we had more time. But in a twist of fate, 1 week later, Mallory got the flu and mono, and then UPMC said she might not be able to be transplanted after all. She was just too sick. There is a fine line between being too sick and not sick enough. Mallory stayed in the hospital for most of November, December, and January until she was finally stable. The call came on a Monday with instructions to fly on Thursday, so Mallory could be in clinic on Friday, which gave us 2 days to pack up our lives for the cross-country move and say goodbye to everyone, knowing she might not make it back. This is the day we left for Pittsburgh. Mallory is hugging Micah on the left, and there were oh so many tears. But Mallory was happy and hopeful when we arrived. To a patient with end-stage lung disease, the most important call you'll ever get is the one letting you know that lungs are available. But that call can come days, weeks, months, or years after you're listed. Once you are listed, every time the phone rings, you jump. You can't exercise, shower, watch a movie, or sleep through the night without your phone right there, which intensifies the experience. But you can't miss a single call. As the days and the weeks pass, your heightened vigilance gives way to hopelessness because you start to feel like that call will never come, or it will come too late. At that point, I changed my mantra to somewhere over the rainbow there are lungs. Those were long, hard days. Someone suggested palliative care. Mallory writes, I need help, but I thought that palliative care was only for old people or dying patients with no other treatment options. That is, until a social worker friend came to visit me. The dark voices in my head, those brokers of hopelessness, met their match in Danielle. Never selling unwarranted optimism, she validated my fears and offered perspective. We discussed advanced care planning and my end-of-life preferences. She introduced me to the concept of palliative care as one of the rounding services, and also voicing my choices, a tool to help terminal patients express what is important to them in case they become unable to speak. Danielle taught me how to manage pain and how to advocate for my own palliative care needs. We discussed grief and fear and coming to terms with a dire prognosis. Danielle inspired Mallory to write her wishes if things were to take a serious turn for the worse. Mallory writes, I want to be as comfortable as possible through opioids or anti-anxiety meds, but not be so out of it that I'm unconscious unless the pain is severe enough to necessitate that. I want to maintain dignity to whatever extent possible, to receive whatever life-saving tactic is appropriate, to maintain my ability to communicate in some way, to have the blinds open for natural light, to have calming music to listen to have my mom, my dad, Micah, Jack, or a friend with me at all times, preferably with a hand on me, so I will feel their presence. I want to live. Meanwhile, we waited. Each day a struggle to breathe. Each day a struggle to stay hopeful. About 6 weeks later, the call came. So we packed, raced to the hospital, and waited 24 hours. In the morning, the surgeon came in to tell us that the lungs were viable, but they were going to another patient. Talk about being blindsided. We didn't know Mallory was a backup candidate, and we didn't even know that that was a real thing. And that leads to insight number 5, which is that doctors should err in favor of giving more information rather than less, as it helps patients and their families manage their expectations. In total, Mallory experienced 3 dry runs, false alarms, where you're called to the hospital and prepped for transplant, but the lungs aren't viable or they go to someone else. Mallory writes about the emotional and physical toll this took on her. She describes in vivid detail the high emotional stakes, her fraying emotions, her unraveling nerves. But all that changed on September 11 of 2017 when Mallory got the fourth and final call. Despite her fear, Mallory was so excited. She was wheeled in for a 9-hour surgery and received the gift of life, lungs. The recovery was absolutely grueling, but 1 month later, she was celebrating her 25th birthday without oxygen. Those days, I would sing to her, "Somewhere over the rainbow, there were lungs." It was the happiest time as we dared to dream about a new life. But tragically, just a few weeks later, Mallory was readmitted with pneumonia, and doctors started preparing me for the worst. They wanted me to tell Mallory that she wasn't going to make it. I refused, and I voiced my choices. Mallory was terrified of dying, so I didn't want her to be afraid. The doctors disagreed, creating another point of contention. But we needed Mallory to have hope, because in these last days of Mallory's life, Mark was working around the clock to get an experimental treatment for her. He had read that penicillin was discovered, and when it was discovered, phage therapy was rendered obsolete. It was a treatment they were working on, but penicillin had patent protection and financial incentives. And since phages are naturally occurring organisms, patent protection would be a huge challenge. So Mark enlisted the help of Stephanie Strathy, an epidemiologist who had used phage therapy to save her husband. And on November 7th, she sent out this nationwide tweet, and many labs responded. Meanwhile, at the doctor's urging, our closest friends and family gathered. Because Mallory was on a ventilator, she scribbled this note, which reads, "Can't talk at all, but so grateful you are all here for the hardest part." On November 14, the United States Navy found a phage match for Mallory's isolate of Cepacia. Dr. John DeCuna from UPMC, the transplant surgeon, came up with an elaborate plan to send their organ retrieval plane and then a helicopter to get it from the Navy's lab to the airport and then to the hospital. We were happy and hopeful when the phages arrived. They're in the white box on the left. That night, Mallory made history and became the first patient with cystic fibrosis to receive phage therapy. But the very next morning, doctors told us that Mallory had been without oxygen for too long and advised us to make the gut-wrenching decision to remove life support. After she died, we asked for an autopsy and learned from the Navy that the phages had started to work, she just didn't get them in time. Mark was not able to save Mallory, but he was certain that phage therapy could save others. We shared Mallory's story with the media, a story that starts in 2016 with Mark's dogged pursuit of this treatment and includes Stephanie's critical contribution. Stat News reported that Mallory died, but her bacterial infection lived on, moving from her ICU room in Pittsburgh to a lab in Ann Arbor and then to Jerusalem, where 3 students found a second phage that was effective against Mallory's strain of Cepacia. They named the bacteria-killing virus BC Mallory 1, using the initials of the bacteria it's active against and Mallory's name, since she inspired the search. While this was happening, Mark was dipping for phages in a sewage treatment plant and bringing phage therapy to the attention of Dr. Mike Boyle and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, because Mark had a vision to treat kids with CF with phage therapy before infection ravaged their lungs, a vision that has led to the first NIH-funded clinical trial for patients with CF. Helping others still in the fight has helped Mark with his grief. As for me, I turned to Mallory's journal. In the last months of her life, she had given me the password, and when I opened it, I found 2,500 pages of her reflections over 10 years. The playful writings of a teenager, the somber insights of a young woman facing death, and instructions to publish the parts that might help others. Mallory writes, "I have a strong urge to do something that will change people, that will have an infectious influence on the way they think and feel that will last." By all accounts, she did. One example, an NPR reporter says that Mallory uses extraordinary imagery to describe a life that burned out before its time, and to convey in very, very poetic language exactly what the suffering is, but also what the glory of the life through that suffering is able to be. Mallory writes in detail in Salt in My Soul about her treatments and hospital stays, the love and unexpected community she found in hospitals, the transcendent intimacy she developed with her care team, and the problems imposed by the medical system she so depended on. Which leads to the last insight I'll share, which is that a life-threatening illness puts you at the intersection of so many public health issues. It turns you into an accidental expert about the ways patient care can and should be improved. Mallory's writing highlights areas in patient care that need addressing. One example, the power every single caregiver has to make daily decisions that affect a patient's quality of life. Doctors, nurses, RTs, PTs, pharmacists, case managers, home health nurse. It's a long list. Despite the serious subject matter, Salt in My Soul is at its core a snapshot of a coming of age, an intimate portrait of a young woman living her life, a life filled with love, laughter, and some very special memories. One I want to share. Mallory had met a guy that she really liked, and she was set to have a third date with him when she found out that her lung function had dropped and she was going to be admitted. She was so incredibly sad to cancel the date, and so I suggested she invite him to the hospital. Why not find out if he could handle her situation? When he said yes, she freaked out because her hair was greasy, her nails were dirty, and her face had broken out. Enter nurse Ashley Trueblood from the UCLA ICU team, who came to the rescue and washed her hair, gave her a pedicure and a facial in the ICU, and then ran to the drugstore to get Mallory mascara. As you can see from the smile on her face, Mallory had a really fun third date. We will forever remember the kindness that this nurse showed Mallory. So it was no surprise to read in Mallory's journal about her deep appreciation for that nurse. Since I sat bedside with Mallory for 67 hospitalizations, most of what I read wasn't a surprise. But what was absolutely shocking was that Mallory's facade of happiness masked a darker truth about experiences and emotions that she hadn't dared to share publicly. She lived happy every day, but in her journal, she expresses anger at her disease, shame about her body and its failings, and the difficulty of straddling the sick and the well worlds. With her writing, Mallory left a roadmap for me to navigate my grief, to navigate the transition from living with Mallory to living without her. This is a class of first-year medical students at Harvard, as I'm sharing her insights with them. When the documentary came out in January, I had another way to share her insights. Both offer a rare look inside the mind of a young woman trying to live fully while dying. Mallory definitely does not have all the answers, but her insights reveal so much about our healthcare system. She used to say that writing helped heal her. I just wish that she had gotten to see how her words are healing others. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. What a moving story. I'm going to ask you to come on camera and join me here so we can start taking questions from the audience. While people are putting questions in the Q&A box, just as a reminder, you put that down in the Q&A section, not the chat, please. I'm going to start you out. I really, your quote, voice your choice, really resonated with me, and I think really resonates probably with the rest of our chronic illness community. I'm curious, because I do think a lot of people don't want to make waves and don't want to challenge people that they feel maybe have more expertise than them. But the reality is that patients are their own expert. And so I'm curious how you helped Mallory navigate that as she became an adult and she had the choice and you no longer had the choice, or you no longer had the say as her parent. So how did you help Mallory do that?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is to say modeling behavior. So whenever I was around, Mallory would not make waves and I would speak for her. And then one time when I had a flat tire, I was supposed to be there to meet her. And the nurse pulled me aside and she said, "You taught your daughter well. She's always so deferential, but when you weren't here, she stood up for herself." So I think that's really it, which is to model behavior when your children are growing up, so that when they get to be the age that they're expected to take care of themselves, they know exactly what to do.
Absolutely. I think that is key. You never know if they're watching you and how much they're watching you, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Jen. She says, why do you think it was so important for Mallory to leave her words behind? How have you seen her legacy grow and help others?
Well, it's interesting because, they talk about the tipping point. I would say all of 2019 and 2020 and 21, I was giving talks and giving talks and giving talks. And I would get feedback from people about how helpful it was. But this year, after 4 years, I sort of feel like the tipping point has occurred. And it's probably related to the fact that the documentary came out and so many more people have seen it and or watched the trailer and know about it than one person going around to doing talks like this, where, it's hard to get a critical mass with so much content out in the world and social media and Netflix and everywhere else. But I think that what's happened is that there has become an increasing focus on patient-centered care, which hospitals tout, but how can you have patient-centered care if you don't have patient voices? And I think that Mallory's story and her book and her words and the documentary are all examples, they're all different mediums to show why you want to listen to the patient, because they really do have a lot to share and they really are experts, accidental, of course, but they know what works and what doesn't. And I think it's really amazing that people are finally starting to care. And as a matter of fact, last year, the New England Journal of Medicine finally wrote an initiative and they've launched an ebook, and it's called The Power of Patient Voice. The reason they did it is actually to get medical offices and doctors and hospitals to increase revenue. And I think it's sort of ironic that that's what it's all about. But at the end of the day, whatever gets people to pay more attention to patient stories, I think is really important.
Absolutely. We have somebody who has read Salt in the Soul who's asking a question here. She says she absolutely loved it and certainly felt closer to Mallory by the end of the book.
Oh, that's great.
And that she was really impressed with in particular, your ability to be her champion and to be super mom. She says, what can organizations like Infusion Access Foundation do to help people who potentially don't have a mom like you in their corner? Do you have any suggestions?
Oh yeah, I absolutely do. I think, first of all, I think there are ways to pair people. Like, for example, find people who either have lost children or who care about patient advocacy, because there's a lot of people out there. I know that because I speak to groups. People ask all the time how they can help, what they can do. I also think offering training sessions with patients for what to do and how to do it are really helpful. And one of the things that I really strongly recommend is that people write out their questions in advance of seeing their caregivers, because it's really easy to get tongue-tied or to forget. And everybody has an opinion, right? Whether it's about the sleep or interruptions of sleep, whether it's whether or not their insurance is going to approve their medications and how they can get help. But I think training patients to be stronger advocates and or pairing them with people who want to help, I think, are the two quickest suggestions that I have.
Those are great suggestions. I am curious, the sort of follow-up question in this person's comment too was, it certainly sounds like you guys had to navigate some really challenging insurance issues. Do you have tips and advice for people who are having to deal with, denials and other challenges in trying to get the treatment that they feel is best?
Well, I say, and I believe that was the hardest thing we ever dealt with non-medically, right? Outside of all of the health diagnoses and treatments and stuff. Fighting with the insurance company was absolutely awful. I'm a very, very articulate writer, spokesperson. My husband's a lawyer. We had every access and privilege you could imagine, and it was still impossible to do it. And it wasn't until a friend intervened. So I am very acutely aware. And what Mallory did was write up, and it's in the book, exactly what happened. And we're hoping, through speaking about it and sort of shaming them into caring. The truth is, in 4 years, I have never had the opportunity to speak to an insurance company. And I tell everybody, put me in front of an insurance company. No insurance company has ever, and I've been invited by Harvard, Stanford, Yale, you name it, but no insurance company has ever wanted me to speak. But I think shaming them, writing about it, speaking about it, posting on social media, however you get that word out, that's one thing. But the other thing that I did learn in all of this is that doctors really have the power. And the sad reality is that doctors are so busy to ask them to do it. But a doctor has to write to an insurance company or call them and say, patient X will only benefit from treatment at this center or using this drug. A lot of times you have to go through the exercise of trying drug A, drug B, drug C until you get to the one that actually is going to work. I know for me, I vomit from anesthesia and I had breast cancer. So I've had a lot of surgeries myself, and I put into the chart. And there were many times where they would say, well, we're not allowed to give you Zofran. This was back before Zofran became more generic and available. But they would have to put me through the exercise of trying all these things that didn't work before they would actually approve it. But the doctor is usually the one that can actually insist on it. So I think pushing the doctors or asking them to advocate on your behalf is a really important tool.
Absolutely. And fortunately, the Infusion Access Foundation has been able to help some people produce letters that they've been able to give to their doctors so that their doctors just have to sign them and maybe fill in a couple of things. So it makes that process a little faster. So I think that's something certainly we as a patient advocacy organization can help with. This is a great question. I love this one. Has Mallory's experience provided you with an opportunity to speak on other platforms? Because certainly CF is a specific disease, but the healthcare navigation is such a broad field. I know you've found other ways to get involved.
Yeah, well, one thing I talk about is memoir as medicine, and it's about patient stories. It's also about providers and parents sharing their stories because there is more than one perspective. But the biggest issue is AMR, which stands for antimicrobial resistance. Mallory's death, I have come to understand, was preventable because people think CF is a deadly disease. But ultimately, she got a lung transplant and she had pristine lungs. And the reason she died was because there were no antibiotics or phage therapy available in time or antifungals, whatever those three modalities are that would have helped her. And so there is legislation pending in Congress right now, bipartisan legislation, which is important because if it isn't bipartisan, it's never going to pass. But this area of AMR superbugs, which I'm sure you've all heard about, is really a global health crisis. And Mallory's story and her writing and her documentary and her book have given me a very big platform to be able to speak in a lot of different venues to try to join the growing chorus of voices who are fighting hard to advocate for this legislation, which we all need, especially in your community. And I strongly urge people to start, keeping their antennas up to learn about that, because I think that's a really big, complicating secondary level of problems that almost everybody that has a health issue will eventually have to deal with.
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah. Let me think here. How did Mallory balance being sick while recording her legacy?
Well, it's interesting because she was just a born writer. Not everybody likes to write, but whatever was happening, she'd always be pounding away. Sometimes we would fight and then she would storm out of the room and go pounding. And I kept thinking that the journal was just going to be a repository for her anger at me, but she actually had some incredible insight that it would have killed me to read bad stuff about me. So she really didn't put it in the journal, which was great. But I think for her, it was an outlet for her stress. She didn't want the world to pity her. She didn't want to live with a pity party. So I think she tried to live happy, and then she channeled all of her fear and anxieties into the journal. But for a lot of people who don't write, there are other ways to do that, to create their legacy. Whether you're a photographer or whether you sew and you want to do a quilt of patterns that fabrics you care about, or whether you collect a particular animal like frogs or something. I think there's lots of ways to leave your mark. Photographs with captions, social media posts, blogs, books, taking your iPhone and recording short videos. I find in the CF community, a lot of people are really wanting to share their stories and they are documenting them in very different ways. And so it's a question. I know you guys have a project that you're working on, and maybe this is a moment to share to this audience if they don't know. Well, no, I was going to have you share because.
Oh, yeah. Well, and actually, fortunately, Andrea was nice enough to put this, so hopefully you guys can see it if you go into the Q&A section. Andrea Perryman has been involved with our organization for a while and is a wonderful volunteer. And she wrote, this is a wonderful and touching presentation. Thank you, Diane. And she said, just wanted to make everyone aware that the Infusion Access Foundation strives to continually get patient stories out in the open. We're looking for poetry submissions from patients who have been diagnosed with chronic illnesses and would like to express their experience in an artistic way. If you're interested in submitting a poem or possibly even a story, please visit patientaccess.org and we will get you in touch with Krista, who will be happy to talk to you about those submissions. So thank you for bringing that up, Diane, because I know that's how you and Andrea connected, is through the Medical Writers Association, which is fantastic. So thank you for bringing that up.
I encourage everybody to do whatever creative expression works for them. Absolutely. I mean, the truth is people establish legacies that are not tangible or physical. For example, when people bake and they bake cookies and that's their thing, and then they die and people remember their recipe for a chocolate cake and they share it, that's a legacy. A legacy is basically any gift that you leave in someone or for them. So it can be tangible or intangible. Absolutely.
A couple more questions because we've got only 5 more minutes. So I do like this question. After referring back to the journals and finding and reading Mallory's journals after she's passed away, this person is asking, how was your experience reading her early journals, and was there anything particularly surprising in them?
Some of the sex stuff was a little bit, felt weird to read about, because she was very detailed in her writing about her experience with her doctors, with boys, with friends. Most of the stuff wasn't really a surprise, but some of that more intimate stuff that she didn't talk about, that was really where the surprise was. I think her probably the most painful, difficult thing for me to read was that she had collected she had made a list of names for children, if she had a boy and if she had a girl. And that was the thing that just, like, I became unglued, because she wanted to have a child. And I have a new friend who I met through a grief group who lost her adult daughter who had just given birth, and she had chosen to do it without a partner. So the grandma, which is my friend, is now the mom. And we talk a lot about whether we wish, the rest of us, whether we wish we had a child. And of course, every one of us would love to have a piece of our children in a grandchild, but that can be hard on the child as well, because this young woman is going to have, an older mom, and that's challenging, and know that her mom died 2 days after childbirth. So there is no perfect solution, but that really was hard for me to read, and surprising that she had given so much thought to the idea of having kids.
Yeah, when I was reading Salt in My Soul, that also touched me, that she was yearning for that, and really realized that perhaps that was not something that was destined for her. And so that was incredibly sad to hear. Yeah.
Okay. So, what's really funny? What's really funny is I have a really hard time. I didn't remember that was in the book. I have a really hard time remembering what was in the book, what was in her journal, what was in her lived experience, what's in the film, what I remember, which, it's all a big blur, but I remember that. And I remember when I read it for the first time, but I'd forgotten that it was in the book. So
yeah, just bits of it, but yes.
Yeah.
I like this question. And I think this is perhaps a good way to end too. What is your opinion about asking for a second opinion about treatments?
100% appropriate whenever you feel that you're not satisfied. 100%. It's your right. And I think any provider that doesn't respect that and respect your own advocacy does not deserve to be practicing medicine.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think even if, you love your doctor, sometimes it's nice just to get another opinion about your care, and you can even still go back to that same doctor. Your doctor is not going to be offended if you go and get a second opinion. Typically, many of them encourage you to go do it. And, sometimes you come back to them, and sometimes you decide another person is a better fit for you, but it's not going to offend anybody. Just like changing therapists, if you find that your mental health therapist isn't quite the right fit for you either, it's always a good idea to find somebody else. So, well, Diane, we have just a couple more minutes, so I want to give you a chance to say any final thoughts.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really healing for me to share Mallory's words, and I know from hearing from people that it's helpful to them. And I hope anybody who hasn't read the book will read the book. And I also encourage you to watch the documentary because you'll get to see Mallory. We have a lot of footage of her.
Oh, that'll be delightful. I mean, I'd like Kendall, who wrote the comment about feeling like she knew her. I feel the same way after reading the book. We feel very close to her. So it'll be nice to see footage of her as well. I haven't had a chance to watch the documentary, but everybody, please do go take a look at that. And Diane, thank you so much for being so open, sharing your daughter's story and your story, and for answering all these questions. I think it's incredibly valuable for our community. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight as well.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.